So, welcome everyone to the virtual world of the Eastside Freedom Library. We are bringing together this evening sort of two strands of the work that we've been doing. One are the interviews that Tom O'Connell brought to us in 2020 called Learning from the Past, Fighting for the Future. And the other is our monthly labor history reading group. As I was explaining to our special guest from Arizona this evening, we've never been able to enforce whether people actually do the reading. And so it's good to get some material out to talk about. I also want to acknowledge that today has been a big day, particularly here in Minnesota. The last week has been a big week since the murder of Daunte Wright. And I think we're all trying to figure out what the next steps are. That I don't think anyone's under illusions that one verdict is going to change the world, and the world needs changing. So I know we were on edge all day and feel a little bit of relief. I don't feel like celebrating, but I do feel some relief. And when we get into the conversation this evening, please feel free to talk about whatever is bubbling inside. So what we're going to do tonight is, so Tom, now my dear friend Tom O'Connell, has become one of those, what we refer to as snowbirds. And so Tom and his partner Becky escape from Minnesota and have been going to Arizona. And whether this is a tax dodge on Tom's part so that he could write off his vacation as a work trip, while he was in Arizona, he discovered this new book, Driving While Brown, and discovered these two great journalists who wrote the book and had the wonderful idea to, now that we live in the world of Zoom, to invite them to virtually come to Minnesota and have a conversation with us. And so Tom is going to interview Terry and Jude, and he will introduce them.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for coming and participating. I did want to mention, in addition, this is recorded, as are, I think, most, if not all, virtual events at Eastside Freedom Library. We have a great website, and so please let people know. I have some friends who have other meetings. That's the kind of friends I have, always having meetings. And I've encouraged them to go to the ESFL website, which is www.eastsidefreedomlibrary.org, right, Peter? And then you'll be able to just tell people to do it and they'll be able to hear it. So I'm very excited. I really want to thank our guests. Terry Greene Sterling is an affiliated faculty at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. Some of us remember Walter Cronkite with great fondness. And a contributor to the Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and Newsweek, among many others. And Jude Joffe-Block has reported for the Associated Press, National Public Radio, and The Guardian. And together they have written this wonderful book. I really can attest to it. Driving While Brown, Sheriff Joe Arpaio versus the Latino Resistance, published by the California Press. So welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And when I go back to Arizona next year, I'll drive up from Tucson, and if you wouldn't mind, I'll email you in advance, and maybe we can have coffee or something, and we can revisit this. I've read the book, and I can really give it, 4 stars. It's great journalism, and it is exciting to read, and it is informative. So putting all that together is no small task. Well, let's start with Joe Arpaio himself. I think lots of people up here kind of knew him. I used to think about him as the Arizona equivalent or the anti-immigrant equivalent of Sheriff Bull Connors from Alabama way back in the civil rights days. So a truly kind of notorious character. But you paint a very, I think, compelling picture of him. I actually half liked him, at least in the beginning. So tell us a little about Joe Arpaio. What kind of person was he? How did you get the tremendous access you got to him? You must have known you were going to write stuff that didn't exactly comport with his ideology, but he seemed to want to talk with you all the time. So just tell us a little bit about Sheriff Joe.
Maybe I should do a little bit of a bio, and then Jude can talk about the access. So Joe Arpaio was born the son of an Italian immigrant during a time when Italian immigrants were unwanted in the United States. His dad barely made the quota, the very narrow quota for Italian immigrants allowed to come into the United States. And they were viewed as, they were viewed by whites who were from Northern European countries as undesirable immigrants. And there was a license to use slurs against immigrants and to make fun of them and to affix all the stereotypes to them that we hear about Mexican immigrants today: lazy, shiftless, disease-ridden, et cetera, et cetera. So he grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and did not have a very, as he tells us, didn't seem like it was a very warm home life. His mother died. His father later remarried, and there were step-family complications, and Arpaio struggled in school. The stories that he tells us of his childhood recount as sort of a lonely childhood in which a dog was his best friend. And so it was not an ideal childhood. He subsequently went into the Drug Enforcement Administration, which had a different name then, Bureau of Narcotics. And he learned several things that are very telling and compelling for his later life as sheriff of Arizona. The first thing he learned was how to charge people with conspiracies. So he liked to tell us he's a conspiracy guy. The second thing that he learned while in drug enforcement was to assume personas, to go undercover. And in my view, he assumes a persona when he's elected sheriff many years later and becomes the persona of America's toughest sheriff. And the other thing that he learned was that he could please his father if he got in the newspaper. He describes his father as somewhat distant and very hardworking, and praise did not come easily from the father for that son. And so, but when he got in the newspaper, the father was thrilled, and that starts this lifelong quest to be in media no matter what, which will impact the later days as Arizona sheriff. He runs for sheriff. He retires from the DEA in Phoenix in 1982, goes to work at his wife's travel agency, isn't crazy about that, empties wastebaskets, won't learn how to use a computer, so he's relegated to selling tickets, and he says he emptied a lot of wastebaskets. So he ran for sheriff in 92 successfully, and became famous around the world for really what I view as very cruel and humiliating treatment of immigrants. He would make them wear pink underwear, and he was written about around the world for pink underwear, 2 meals a day, gloppy food. And some of the sentenced inmates in his jails were forced to live in open air tents. So Phoenix, oddly enough, gets pretty cold in the winter, and well, I guess not by your standards, but by ours. And also it gets very, very brutally hot in the summer. And so those were the things that made him famous in his early years as the persona that he assumed, America's toughest sheriff. We'll go into his pivot into immigration later, but I want Jude to talk about how we got access.
And I mean, it dovetails with that because, I mean, when we interviewed his longtime media director who had come from TV, she said she understood immediately that he wanted to be on television, and that was her job, was to get him media, and he was very good at it. I mean, there was always a new innovation of a different jail punishment that would get a new headline. So, you know, take away the condiments from the jail, take away the girly magazines, take away the cigarettes. I mean, so just one thing after another would generate a story, and it ramps up from there. And so by the time, I mean, Terry had her first interview with Arpaio in 2009. I started covering his issues related to him in 2012. I think I sat down with him for the first time in 2013. But he was very keen to give interviews, really with anyone. I think foreign outlets, he was excited about. Students, he was generous with his time. He often kept a tally of how many interviews he had. He kept his sheriff's office in downtown Phoenix had this large, in the waiting area, there was sort of this large coffee table that was a glass cover that had all different covers of magazines that he was on. And so there was really a collection of memorabilia about his coverage. And so when it came to us writing this book, we approached him in 2016 about the book, and really just showed up at events. We got a lot of access by coming to his press events. He was sheriff at the time, and being there and asking him questions while he happened to not be too busy, and then requesting interviews, and he granted us interviews. And we really did want to understand his perspective and include that in this book. It was important to us that he be represented in that way. So I mean, it really, I think that most media, I mean, he's granted interviews with far more hard-hitting outlets, in the sense that outlets that really have him on to mock him, like Borat or other kinds of sort of gotcha type programs, which wasn't what we were about. But he has granted interviews to those types. And I asked him once if he regretted that. And he said, as long as they spell the name right. So I think that's very much his philosophy, is that publicity is good.
So one of the things that I wonder about is some of the things that he did. I'm thinking now about the jails. I mean, that jail of his was like almost sadistic, the ways he treated students, or prisoners. How did this sort of combination of being a really, capable, great, I think, cruelty, kind of go with this personality as being someone who willing to talk with you and get along?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, but I mean, he's a politician, right? And a very skilled politician, and I think that's your answer. He was not thrilled when people wrote about his jails, and there were instances in his jails in which, when we're thinking about today and people dying at the hands of law enforcement, and I am struck by how many people may have died at the hands of law enforcement that we don't know about, right? And jails all over the country. In Arpaio's case, there were very well publicized cases in which families of victims who had died sued Arpaio and the county, and achieved settlements and judgments totaling millions of dollars. So I think Arpaio's jail was more under a microscope. And people died. They died in restraint chairs, and they died while being, beat up or tased, or not getting medicine. Not a lot of people that we know about, but I think about jails all over the country that don't have that kind of scrutiny. especially today.
But I think it's also, it was part of the brand wasn't, in his mind, the brand wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was, in his mind, a deterrent, and it was going to keep people of Maricopa County safe, so that you would make jail a place that no one would want to come back to. And so there was sort of this greater good that was being served in that way. So that was how it was marketed. Recidivism experts don't always agree that these are the techniques that are most effective, but that's how it was built.
It was how it was marketed. I'm not sure if recidivism or publicity was the ultimate goal. But his for sure, his story is, it was to make people not want to come back.
You write about the restrictionist movement, which is not a term that's all that familiar here, at least for some of us. And I think about Arizona as one time being part of Mexico, and then the Mexican-American War. You go a little bit into that history. And the relationship between Mexican Americans and whites who came, many of them from the South, from the Confederacy, or soon after. So how would you describe the relationship between many whites and Mexican immigrants and this restrictionist movement? What was that?
So the restrictionist movement started in the 1920s with the eugenics movement, and it was the influence of the eugenics movement on immigration policy. And that's, Arpaio felt the brunt of that. The term is revived. It's called restrictionism because those who espoused it wanted to severely restrict immigration into the United States. So they were called restrictionists. The term has been revived in the 21st century to account for current policies in which immigration is restricted. And the question that you asked about the relationship between Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans, and some elements of the non-Latino white population, it was not a great place. The border towns were very, very well, they didn't have the problems that the rest of the state had. Maricopa County, where we live, where Arpaio was sheriff, is pretty far north of the border. The border towns had a completely different sensibility about, and people intermarried frequently. But as they moved north, Mexican Americans were, after the Mexican-American War, they were now, deprived of everything, deprived of their livelihoods and of their lands and of their, their means of living that they had lived forever in, and went on to be segregated. They were paid less money in the mines, as well, and the unions, which I'd love Jude to talk about, played a huge role in kind of equalizing or starting the end of segregation in Arizona's mining towns. There was a time when Mexican Americans and Mexicans were considered so dirty that they weren't allowed to swim in the same swimming pool water as whites. So they would swim in the swimming pools and they would drain the pools and fill them up again. And the unions had a huge role in making things better. Jude?
Yeah, and I mean, I think from what I understand that sort of each, Arizona has several mining towns, and there was a different culture, slightly different culture in each one, and we're certainly not experts on all of the intricacies, but one thing that we found really fascinating is that, as we go on, we'll talk more about some of the activists who are part of the resistance that builds against Arpaio, but there's a phenomenon that in the 1960s and 70s, there's all these Mexican American young people who go to ASU for college, Arizona State University. And we learned in our reporting that a lot of the activists who kind of formed the Chicano movement at ASU were all kids. They all called themselves the kids from the mining towns. And that they explained it to me that that there were Mexican-American kids from Phoenix as well, but it was the mining town kids who had grown up with a culture of organizing, that they'd grown up in union culture, and they understood how to organize and they understood how to demand things. And so the Metro chapter that ultimately forms, and but this Chicano movement, they start fighting for things like workers' rights on campus and other kinds of efforts. But it is a very interesting phenomenon that we see over time, sort of this overrepresentation of people with mining town roots being involved in activism later on. And so even though the population numbers are small, they play sort of an outsized role. And I mean, and I guess just to elaborate, I mean, one of the people we profile heavily in the book is Alfredo Gutierrez, who grew up in locals call it Miami, others call it Miami, mining town, and he describes his first years of education being segregated, and credits union organizing for desegregating the schools, for desegregating the Y as the YMCA, as Terry spoke about, and so it is a really interesting phenomenon about how that current plays out for decades.
Great that you bring that up and bring it to the forefront. Can you talk a little bit about what some of Arpaio's actions were? The book is called Driving While Brown. So what is that about? I know it's a lot more than driving. There were a lot of repressive techniques, but tell us about it.
Jude?
Yeah, I mean, so the traffic stops were a really big deal in the legal strategy against Arpaio. And so that's one reason to call it that. But there is also history in Arizona, even before Arpaio, of other people of Mexican descent feeling profiled in traffic stops with police. And so one of the first instances that we document in the book is in the 1970s. There's a police department in Peoria, Arizona, which at the time, now it's a big suburb, but at the time it was just a small kind of a bunch of citrus groves, is my understanding, a small town. And there were farm workers who were there as part of that from Mexico. And the police chief at the time got very aggressive and was trying to stop and arrest Mexican farm workers, ask them for their papers, turn them over to Border Patrol. And there was actually a legal action out of that case that created some of the case law that was later used to stop Arpaio. But at the time, people like Danny Ortega, who is an activist that we follow in the book, he was a young 20-something-year-old lawyer, but also a son of a farm worker. And he was observing this police action against farm workers, this idea that they were being targeted in traffic stops. And he felt like they were guilty of driving while brown, and that it was an assault on everyone who looked like them. And so he really articulates in a very powerful way in the book how, as a US citizen who has the same physical traits as the Mexican farm workers, that this kind of profiling is an assault on the entire community, whether you have papers or not, whether you are subject to deportation or not, that this is unequal policing. And so that concept reemerges once Arpaio pivots to immigration enforcement, which happens around 2006 and ramps up even more in 2007. And one of his tactics is that deputies flood neighborhoods. Often these are heavily Latino areas. And they have what they call a zero tolerance policy. They're going to pull over any car for any traffic violation if they see anything. And so that could be a broken taillight, it could be a cracked windshield. And really with all of these contacts, they have opportunity to question people about immigration status. And so that involves asking passengers who are just sitting in a car to also show ID, which is something that happens a lot. And so people who cannot prove that they have legal status are arrested and turned over to ICE in these operations. And a part of the resistance is the activists on the ground. To them, they recognize this as racial profiling right out of the gate. They want to document it, and there's this real grassroots effort to find plaintiffs, to film, to kind of gather evidence, and then work hand in hand with a legal team that ultimately involves the ACLU to bring a federal class action lawsuit against Arpaio and his office.
So was Arpaio's motivation, he kind of discovered one day that this was kind of popular, and then he started just pivoting and doing it more and more because a big part of his constituency liked it. Is that fair?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, what happened was that he was, when he was America's toughest sheriff, humiliating inmates, he actually had befriended, he had many political allies and friends in the Latino community. And there was a guy named Patrick Hobb who stopped some unauthorized migrants at a rest stop, a highway rest stop, and held them at gunpoint. And Arpaio held him accountable. And this caused such a hue and cry among Arpaio's base because they felt that, undocumented immigrants should, they were restrictionists. And the atmosphere against unauthorized immigration was building in Arizona at the time. So he changed his approach after he realized how angry his base had been at him, and he began enforcing immigration steadfastly for the next few years.
He points out that his change happened because the state legislature started passing laws, and it was his duty to enforce those laws. And the timing does comport with that. But it is worth noting that he went above and beyond enforcing what was written down. I mean, he had legal interpretations of some of those laws that went beyond what even some of the lawmakers wanted the law to mean. So it was a very exuberant form of enforcement.
The book is about Sheriff Joe, and Latino resistance. And you really, one of the things that struck me was just how much work and persistence by so many different people pursuing different strategies, was important and necessary. And you tell that story through people. So can you tell us a couple stories of Latina resistance?
Yeah. So the resistance that formed to stop Arpaio had a strategy of going to the courts and going on the streets and going into the public square, and all these things. Different members of the resistance were doing different things. Lydia Guzman is one of our key characters in the book. And she came to Arizona after living in California, where she had been an activist and had run actually for office in California, had been inspired by Prop 187 as well in California, which was a famous voter initiative. But she came to Arizona. She came right after a huge raid in Chandler that was just outrageous and ensnared. One of the things about these raids is that they ensnare not only people who are undocumented, but also a lot of US citizens.
Pre-Arpaio. This is pre-Arpaio. It was just a police chief.
It's 19,
Oh,
it was
okay.
in Chandler, right, I'm sorry.
This was before Arpaio had pivoted. But
it's kind of speaks to how Mexicans and Mexican Americans are repeatedly sort of have their civil rights violated in Arizona, and they have to keep rising up and fighting it. Anyway, she came after that and immediately became active. And when the day laborers and other immigrants and Mexican Americans decided in the resistance that they were going to file a lawsuit against Arpaio alleging racial profiling and unconstitutional policing, she went out to these really terrifying events, shock and awe sweeps that Arpaio had, and documented the names of those who had been stopped and witnesses, and gathered plaintiffs for this lawsuit. And that was really one of her main jobs for years. And she paid an enormously high price for this, for her activism. She had severe financial problems, and she had family tensions, but she couldn't stop because she saw what was happening. She was witnessing children and parents being separated and families being separated. And it was horrifying to her, and she couldn't stop. So she sacrificed a lot, but kept going. She's one. Jude, you want one?
Well, I just wanted to make a broader point too, just to bring it back to some of the labor themes that the group is interested in, which because what you see in Arizona is that actually there was a union presence kind of thread, and we don't focus on this a lot in the book, but that basically in 2004, there was a ballot initiative that was a real turning point in Arizona. And this was kind of like Arizona's version of Prop 187. It was called Prop 200, and it passed in 2004 overwhelmingly. And it restricted the kinds of benefits that immigrants could access in Arizona. And though, well, some of them were things that they couldn't access anyway. But it also involved things like voter ID and made voting sort of a little bit you had to prove more things to vote and more restrictive. So after Prop 200, SEIU was part of this coalition that joined together to try to defeat that, but it didn't work. But then in 2006, you'll remember that there were a massive wave of immigrant rights marches all around the country.
Huge one here.
Yeah, and in Phoenix, a coalition came together to try to launch the Phoenix version of that march. And SEIU was a big part of that, and actually put up a lot of the money involved for insurance for that march. And really without them, a lot of people say it might not have happened. And it was an enormous march in Phoenix. And I think there was another union involved. It might have been HERE. Forgive me if I'm misremembering that. Basically, there are all these different facets of the immigrant rights community, including teachers and students, but also groups like LULAC and, groups that just really hadn't had anything to do with each other, all gathered in, it actually happened to be a union hall that they borrowed, and sat around in a big circle and thought, how are we going to wage this big Phoenix march? And the coalition that formed for that march, they called themselves Somos America, which borrowed from a national name for the national coalition that had launched it. They continue meeting in 2006. So they had originally come together for this march, and then they keep going because Arpaio is ramping up, and they quickly realize that they need to be responding to this very local threat that's happening to the immigrant rights community, or to the immigrant community. And Somos America actually ends up being a named plaintiff, this new coalition, in at least 2 of the lawsuits that are waged against Arpaio as an effort to stop him. So, so that kind of brings you right around to the labor stuff.
Right, and that law that kicked off that proposition that kicked off this huge march, or the atmosphere of this huge march, that proposition takes us back to the whole restrictionist issue, because there were restrictionist nonprofits in Washington, D.C. that helped fund these laws in Arizona, or these initiatives. And one is the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And so once again, we go back to that nexus between restrictionism and civil rights, and how the immigration theme impacts American citizens of color.
I want to ask one more big picture question, and then kind of finish with the defeat of Sheriff Joe and the Trump pardon. And the big one is, or big picture is, you have a lot of immigrants, some undocumented, seeking jobs coming from Central America, Mexico. I don't know how much Latin America beyond Mexico and Central America. You don't address it really directly, but what is the relationship between, I'll just put it out there, capitalism, or the way corporations, or the economic relationships in the hemisphere, or that's behind all this?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The timing is such that you start to see a real uptick in, especially people crossing the Arizona border in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so what some people have pointed to is that there's NAFTA happens in Mexico and is a real disruptor for a lot of different kinds of sectors. And so there is a lot of migration that's prompted by that in the 90s. And then Arizona becomes very desirable as a place, as a destination, because it's fairly inexpensive. And there's, for a while, a ton of jobs because there's this housing boom, and it later busts. But so there is a period of time where Phoenix really becomes a destination, and for that reason, and I believe some resentment probably grows among the people who had been in the trades and had steady work, and there might be competitors who are coming in willing to do certain jobs at a lower rate, and especially in the construction industry.
So you mentioned court cases, and before the show, we were talking about how much, initially the book was going to be largely about this long, complex court decision or court action. What did Sheriff Joe, I love calling him Sheriff Joe, what law did he violate that ultimately was his undoing?
Well, he was found to have racially profiled Latino drivers and passengers, which is unconstitutional. Later on, there are a lot of investigations and a lot of other cases, but the key thing to remember is that he's found to have engaged in unconstitutional policing. And then after that, he violates he doesn't follow a judge's order. So he ultimately gets charged with criminal contempt of court. So he's got these two different issues going on: the unconstitutional policing and then the criminal contempt of court charge. It carries with it the remote possibility, because he's a very old man, of a jail sentence. And before Arpaio actually goes to the courtroom and gets sentenced by the judge, Trump, his friend, jumps in and gives him his first presidential pardon.
Very first pardon, okay.
And Arpaio was among the first to endorse Trump when he was running for president. Right. I think he was tied with maybe like Jerry Falwell Jr. like on the same day. And so it is very interesting that how these two men, the very important role they played for each other.
Yeah, they were very similar. And the activists in Arizona, once Trump came on the scene, and once they saw his stance on immigration, they began to call Trump the national Arpaio. They were that similar. And certainly Trump studied some of Arpaio's previous successes with immigration enforcement, political successes. And we start hearing restrictionist rhetoric from Trump. And his famous speech in Arizona, in which he demeans Mexicans and Mexican immigrants. But anyway, they were good friends, or not close buddies, but I think they had a mutual admiration society.
So in the end, Arpaio is convicted and pardoned by Trump, and Trump loses Arizona. First time that Republicans lost Arizona since Harry Truman.
No,
So
yeah.
it was kind of a big deal. I think that's right. I don't know.
I think
Close.
Clinton, there was a Clinton victory.
Oh, Clinton did. Yeah.
But I'm not, it might, yeah, and
I think you're right. I
the
think
county
you're right.
went slightly different. Yeah, but yeah, it had been a long time, and even, you know, the really once since Truman. Yeah.
So do you think it's fair to say that the Latino resistance led to a growth of political power more generally for Latinos in Arizona, and that's helped move the state at least a little bit toward a progressive direction? Or is that me being
I mean, the
editorializing?
the reasons for the 2020 flip that we saw are multiple. It's not just one thing, but I think it's very clear to us that one of those things is that that there was this movement that from about 2006 to 2016 was trying to do on the ground voter outreach to try to get Arpaio out, and that laid the groundwork. I mean, there were kids in high school who were part of that effort, and then they start growing up over the years. They become more and more seasoned, and they're coming back cycle after cycle, sometimes walking the same neighborhoods and building relationships with some of these voters that really campaigns don't spend a lot of time on because they don't have much of a history of voting, and they're not kind of going to be their first place to invest. But some of these on the ground activists who come from these communities mobilize their own neighborhoods and really get out the vote in these communities of color that didn't have a history of voting. And so we see, I mean, what we heard from some of the activists doing that work was that after Joe Arpaio lost in 2016, he lost by 13 points, that there was a new energy among these communities in terms of seeing that their vote could matter, and that it was easier to get out the vote after that. And so we spoke with one activist who told us that she'd been canvassing neighborhoods since 2011 when she was in high school, and then she did it again in 2020. And she said she'd never seen voters so enthusiastic, and that it was this sense that we can get out the villains. And so, yeah, the kinds of infrastructure that was built as part of the backlash seems to have changed the political landscape. But there are other factors as well. There were, you know, Arizona has a long history of moderate Republicans who were more in the mold of John McCain, who were turned off by Trump. There were suburban voters who turned away from Trump. There were communities beyond the Latino community. Native Americans played a big role, Black voters, Asian voters, and also transplants from other states. We have a lot of Californians coming to Arizona that are also changing the state.
Yeah, and suburban voters, I mean, you know, the same picture that took place across the country. But it's important to note that even though this happened, even though, you know, Biden got this narrow victory in Arizona, the Arizona State House is reliably red, as it is in many places across the country. And what many view as, you know, Jim Crow voter suppression measures are being considered, many of them are being considered in Arizona. So there's a lot of work for the resistance, they tell us, still to do. And they're also, it's important to note that some of Arpaio's policies are still intact. So while Arpaio is no longer in power, some of his policies remain, and they're still, you know, battling those.
And finally, before we switch over and open it up, I'm just curious. This was a hugely long and intense process for the two of you. What's been the impact, personally, professionally?
We're just exhausted. That's the
Yeah, I mean, today is the official release of the book. So it was out a little bit early in certain stores, but today is the official release day. So we have yet to see the real impact of it. But I think we both felt so strongly that it was this chapter of Arizona history that had to be written, and it would be better if it was written while it was still fresh. So it was kind of a labor of love. It felt like somebody really had to do it. And yeah, I still feel like this book was needed.
And the other thing is, we found the characters so interesting. We used the technique of, narrative journalism, which is, as much as possible, we use the techniques of novel writing to tell the true story of what happened. So we got in the heads of our characters, and they told the experiences through them and through their memories. And it was really fascinating for us to learn, about their struggles and their victories, and sometimes their failures, and to understand them as human beings.
And that was what was interesting about following people on both sides, because we also spoke a lot with Arpaio supporters, and some of the same moments in time that were a victory for one side were devastation for the other, and then it would flip. Like they both sides kind of went through a roller coasters over time, with their fortunes changing, and sort of to see this kind of the same dates through those two different lenses was really interesting.
Thank you so much for the book, and I could tell it was a labor, but it seemed like a labor of love. I mean, you guys are really right there with your reporting and your conversations and your respect for people, as you say, from all sides. Combining that with some pretty serious legal research, and a dash of history and social analysis, it's a beautiful book, and I really recommend it to everybody.